Sometimes the loneliest souls carry the deepest wounds, and sometimes it takes the pure heart of a child to heal what years of pain have broken. In the frontier town of Cedar Ridge, Elias Boone was the man everyone feared, 6 feet tall, scarred, and silent as the grave. The townsfolk called him the Scary Mountain Man. They said he'd killed men and lived wild in the mountains. Mothers pulled their children away when he walked by. No one spoke to him, and he spoke to no one. But one summer day, a 6-year-old girl named Sarah changed everything. She had lost her family to bandits and had nowhere to go. When she saw Elias sitting alone, she noticed something no adult ever had: tears in his eyes. Without fear, she climbed up beside him and gently wiped those tears away. That simple act of kindness broke through walls he'd built around his heart for 20 years. What happens when the most dangerous man in town discovers that love might be the one thing worth fighting for? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the weathered boardwalk of Cedar Ridge, painting the dusty main street in shades of gold and amber. It was the kind of light that made even the roughest frontier town look touched by grace, though most folks were too busy with their daily concerns to notice such beauty. The general store's bell chimed as Martha Henley stepped out to sweep her porch, the familiar rhythm of frontier life beginning another day. But this morning carried something different in the air, a tension that seemed to settle on shoulders like dust from a passing wagon train. Word had spread through the small community faster than wildfire. The Scary Mountain Man had taken in the orphaned girl. Elias Boone's cabin sat 3 miles up the winding mountain trail, nestled among towering pines that had stood sentinel for decades before the first settlers arrived. Built from hand-hewn logs and chinked with mountain clay, it was a fortress of solitude that reflected its owner's need for distance from the world below. The single room was sparse but functional. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, a rough-hewn table and 2 chairs occupied the center, and a narrow bed pressed against the far corner. Until yesterday, it had been a place where silence reigned supreme, where the only sounds were the crackling of fire and the distant call of mountain birds. Now, a small figure in a torn calico dress sat on the cabin's front steps, her bare feet barely reaching the ground. Sarah's dark hair hung in tangled waves around a face that seemed far too serious for her 6 years. In her lap, she clutched the only possessions that remained from her previous life, a small cloth doll with button eyes and a tarnished locket that had belonged to her mother. Inside the cabin, Elias moved with the careful precision of a man unaccustomed to sharing his space. At 37, he was built like the mountains themselves, solid, imposing, and seemingly immovable. His weathered hands, scarred from years of hard living, fumbled with the simple task of preparing breakfast for 2 instead of 1. The coffee pot rattled against the iron stove as he tried to remember how his own mother had made porridge all those years ago. His storm-grey eyes, the same eyes that had struck fear into grown men, softened whenever they fell upon the small girl who had somehow breached his carefully constructed walls. Those same eyes had seen things that would haunt lesser men: violence, betrayal, loss that cut deeper than any blade. Yet yesterday, when Sarah had reached up with her tiny hand to wipe away tears he hadn't even realized he was shedding, something inside him had cracked open like ice in spring. The people of Cedar Ridge knew little about Elias Boone's past, but they knew enough to keep their distance. He'd arrived 5 years ago, emerging from the mountains like a ghost made flesh, carrying nothing but a worn saddlebag and the kind of haunted expression that marked men who'd seen too much. Sheriff Jameson had asked the necessary questions: where he'd come from, what business he had in Cedar Ridge, but Elias's answers had been short and unrevealing. He'd claimed a small plot of land up the mountain, paid in gold coins that raised eyebrows, but no official questions, and proceeded to live a life of complete isolation. The townspeople had created their own stories to fill the silence. Some whispered that he'd been a soldier in the war, broken by what he'd witnessed on distant battlefields. Others claimed he'd been an outlaw, fled to the mountains to escape justice. The more imaginative souls spoke of Indian raids, of families lost to violence, of a man driven mad by grief and guilt. But all agreed on one thing: Elias Boone was dangerous, and decent folks were wise to steer clear. Martha Henley paused in her sweeping, her weathered hands gripping the broom handle as she gazed up toward the mountain trail. At 53, she'd buried 2 husbands and raised 4 children in this unforgiving land. Life had taught her to read people like storm clouds on the horizon, and something about the mountain man's story didn't sit right with her maternal instincts. "Morning, Martha." The voice belonged to Reverend Samuel Clark, a thin man with kind eyes who'd been tending to Cedar Ridge's spiritual needs for the past 8 years. He'd arrived on the morning stage, his black coat already showing signs of trail dust. "Reverend," Martha nodded, though her gaze remained fixed on the mountain path. "You heard about what happened yesterday?" Samuel adjusted his hat against the morning sun. Hard not to hear. Whole towns talking about it. Poor child, losing her family like that. The tragedy had occurred 2 days ago, just 5 miles south of town. A family of settlers, the Mitchells, had been making their way to California when bandits struck their wagon train. Most of the travelers had been killed outright, but little Sarah had somehow survived by hiding beneath her mother's body until the danger passed. A passing cavalry patrol had found her 3 hours later, traumatized and alone. Sheriff Jameson had brought her to town, intending to find someone willing to take in the orphaned child. Cedar Ridge wasn't a wealthy community, and most families were already stretched thin by the demands of frontier life. The discussion had gone on for hours, with various townspeople offering excuses about why they couldn't possibly accommodate another mouth to feed. That's when Elias had appeared. He'd come to town for his monthly supplies, as was his custom: flour, coffee, ammunition, and the few other necessities his mountain life required. But instead of conducting his business in silence and disappearing back up the trail, he'd lingered. People had noticed him watching the discussion about Sarah's fate, though none had dared to approach him directly. Then, without a word, he'd walked over to where the small girl sat on the sheriff's office steps. Martha had witnessed the moment from across the street, and even now, she could hardly believe what she'd seen. The fearsome mountain man had knelt before the child, his massive frame somehow gentle as he'd spoken words too quiet for others to hear. Sarah had looked up at him with those dark, serious eyes, and something had passed between them, an understanding that transcended the need for lengthy explanations. When Elias had straightened and announced his intention to take the girl, the silence had been deafening. Sheriff Jameson had stammered about proper procedures and town approval, but Elias had simply lifted Sarah into his arms and carried her toward his horse. The child had gone willingly, her small arms circling his neck with a trust that seemed to surprise them both. "Seems unnatural," came a voice from behind Martha. She turned to see Harold Grayson, the town's banker and self-appointed moral authority. A man of soft hands and harder opinions, Harold had never liked the mystery surrounding the mountain man. A dangerous man like that, raising a young girl. No telling what kind of influence. What kind of influence? Martha's voice carried a sharpness that made Harold step back. The influence of a man who was willing to take in a child when the rest of us found excuses not to. Reverend Clark nodded thoughtfully. "Perhaps we should reserve judgment until we see how the situation develops. The Lord works in mysterious ways, and that child needed help." But Harold wasn't easily deterred. "Mark my words, Reverend, no good will come of this. A man doesn't live alone in the mountains for 5 years without reason. And now he's got that poor child up there, isolated from decent Christian folk." As if summoned by their conversation, a figure appeared at the far end of the street. Elias Boone rode his bay, gelding at an easy pace, Sarah seated in front of him in the saddle. The child's small hands gripped the saddle horn, while her protector's larger hands held the reins with practiced ease. They made an unlikely pair, the feared mountain man and the orphaned girl, but something about the scene struck Martha as remarkably right. The townspeople who happened to be on the street found sudden interest in their morning tasks, unwilling to meet Elias's steady gaze as he guided his horse toward the general store. Sarah, however, seemed fascinated by everything around her. Her dark eyes took in the bustling activity with the curiosity of a child who'd been thrust into an entirely new world. Elias dismounted with fluid grace, then reached up to lift Sarah down. His movements were careful, almost reverent, as if he feared she might break at too rough a touch. The child's feet touched the ground, and she immediately moved to stand close beside him, her small hand finding his larger one with unconscious trust. "Good morning," Elias said quietly as he approached the store's entrance. His voice, rarely heard in town, carried a rough quality that spoke of long periods of silence. Martha noticed how Sarah's presence seemed to have changed something fundamental about his posture. He stood less like a man, expecting trouble, and more like someone with something precious to protect. "Morning, Mr. Boone," Martha replied, her voice warmer than most townspeople would have managed. "How are you settling in, young lady?" she asked, directing her attention to Sarah. The girl looked up at Elias before answering, as if seeking permission to speak. He gave an almost imperceptible nod, and she found her voice. "We had pancakes for breakfast," she said softly. "Elias burned the first ones, but the second ones were good." A ghost of a smile touched the corners of Elias's mouth, the first smile anyone in Cedar Ridge had ever witnessed from the mountain man. "She's a patient teacher," he said, his hand gently squeezing Sarah's fingers. The simple exchange sent ripples through the small crowd of onlookers. This wasn't the fearsome, silent figure they'd grown accustomed to avoiding. This was a man learning to be human again, guided by the innocent wisdom of a child who'd seen her own share of darkness. But not everyone was moved by the touching scene. Harold Grayson cleared his throat loudly, drawing attention to his disapproval. "Mr. Boone, the town council would like a word with you about this arrangement." Elias's expression hardened instantly, the warmth vanishing from his eyes like clouds covering the sun. His free hand moved instinctively toward his hip, where his gun belt rested, a movement so subtle that most wouldn't have noticed, but those who'd lived through violence recognized the gesture immediately. "What kind of word?" Elias asked, his voice dropping to a tone that made even Harold take a half-step backward. "Well, we're concerned about the child's welfare, naturally. A young girl needs proper influences, education, the guidance of Christian women." "She needs safety," Elias interrupted, his grey eyes fixed on Harold with unwavering intensity. "She needs someone who'll make sure she doesn't end up like her parents, dead on some lonely trail, because decent folk couldn't be bothered to protect her." Sarah moved closer to Elias, pressing against his leg like a small bird, seeking shelter from a storm. Her gesture seemed to calm something in the mountain man's demeanor, reminding him that he wasn't alone anymore, that someone depended on him to remain in control. Reverend Clark stepped forward, his voice gentle but firm. "Mr. Boone, I think what Harold means is that we're all concerned for Sarah's well-being. Perhaps there are ways the community could help, like they helped yesterday?" Elias's question carried no anger, only a quiet observation that struck deeper than any shout. When she needed a place to sleep, and everyone had reasons why she couldn't stay with them. The silence that followed was heavy with uncomfortable truth. Martha felt heat rise in her cheeks as she remembered her own hesitation the day before. Her house was small, her resources limited, her health not what it used to be. All valid reasons, but reasons nonetheless. "That's different," Harold protested weakly. "Is it?" Elias asked. He looked down at Sarah, whose dark eyes watched the adults with the solemn attention of a child who'd learned that adult conversations often determined her fate. "What do you think, little one? Do you want to stay with me, or would you prefer to find somewhere else?" Sarah's answer came without hesitation. "I want to stay with you." Her small voice carried absolute certainty. You make good coffee, and you didn't run away when I had bad dreams." The simple statement hung in the morning air like a bell toll, clear and undeniable. Elias Boone, the scary mountain man, whom mothers used to frighten misbehaving children, had comforted a traumatized little girl through her nightmares. He'd burned pancakes while learning to cook for two. He'd opened his isolated world to include someone who needed protection more than she needed judgment. Martha Henley made her decision in that moment. "Mr. Boone," she said clearly, her voice carrying across the street. "If you need anything for the child, clothes, supplies, anything at all, you let me know. And if certain folks want to complain about a man doing what's right, they can take it up with me." A few other voices murmured agreement, though they were notably fewer than the whispered conversations that had been circulating since yesterday. Still, it was something, a crack in the wall of suspicion and fear that had surrounded Elias since his arrival in Cedar Ridge. Elias nodded once to Martha, a gesture of acknowledgement and gratitude that spoke volumes. Then he turned toward the general store, Sarah's hand still securely in his. "Come on, little one, let's get those supplies and head home." As they disappeared into the store, the crowd began to disperse, but the conversations continued in hushed tones. Some spoke with grudging approval of the mountain man's actions, while others muttered darkly about the impropriety of the situation. But one thing had changed irrevocably. Elias Boone was no longer just the scary mountain man. He was a man with someone to protect, someone who'd given him a reason to rejoin the human race. And up on the mountain, in a cabin that had known only silence for 5 long years, the sound of a child's laughter would soon echo through rooms that had forgotten what joy sounded like. The morning sun climbed higher, burning away the mist that clung to the mountainside, revealing the path that would lead both Elias and Sarah toward a future neither of them could yet imagine. 3 days had passed since Elias and Sarah had become an unlikely family, and the mountain cabin was slowly transforming from a bachelor's retreat into something resembling a home. Sarah's few possessions, her cloth doll and her mother's locket, had found places of honor on the rough-hewn mantelpiece, and the sound of her voice had begun to fill corners that had known only echo and silence. The locket had become a source of both comfort and mystery. It was a delicate piece of silver, tarnished with age, containing a miniature portrait of a woman with Sarah's same dark eyes and serious expression. On the back, an inscription read, "To my beloved Margaret, with all my love, J.W." Sarah had explained that Margaret was her mother's name, but she knew nothing about the mysterious J.W. who had given the precious gift. Elias found himself studying the locket with growing unease. Something about the woman's face seemed familiar, though he couldn't place where he might have seen it before. The craftsmanship was too fine for a simple settler's family, and the silver too pure for a trinket bought at some frontier trading post. It spoke of wealth, of connections to a world far removed from wagon trains and mountain cabins. "She was the most beautiful lady in the whole world," Sarah said quietly, settling beside Elias on the cabin steps. She'd been watching him examine the locket with the intensity she was learning to associate with his deeper thoughts. "I'm sure she was," Elias replied, carefully placing the locket back in Sarah's small hands. "Tell me about her." Sarah's face brightened with the joy of shared memories. "Mama could sing like the birds in the morning. Papa said she had the voice of an angel. And she could read, she had lots of books, and she taught me my letters. We were going to California so Papa could start a new business. Mama said there would be schools there, and I could learn to read all kinds of books." Elias felt his chest tighten at the casual mention of the future that had been stolen from this child. "What kind of business was your papa planning?" "I don't know exactly. Something about land and houses. Mama said we'd have a big house with glass windows and a garden where I could plant flowers." Sarah's voice grew wistful. "Do you think there are flowers in heaven?" The question hit Elias like a physical blow. He'd spent 5 years running from thoughts of death and eternity, burying himself in the mountains to avoid confronting the weight of his own actions. Now this small girl, who'd lost everything, was asking him about hope and heaven with the trust of someone who believed he might actually have answers. "I think," he said carefully, "that if there's any justice in the world, your mama and papa are somewhere beautiful, watching over you." Sarah nodded solemnly, as if this confirmation matched her own certainty. "I think so too. That's why they sent me to you. Mama always said the scary-looking people are sometimes the nicest ones underneath." Before Elias could respond to this innocent wisdom, the sound of approaching horses broke the mountain silence. Two riders were making their way up the winding trail, moving with the purposeful pace of men on official business. Elias recognized Sheriff Jameson's lanky form immediately, but the second rider was unfamiliar. A well-dressed man, whose expensive hat and polished boots marked him as someone from far beyond Cedar Ridge's dusty streets. "Sarah," Elias said quietly, his voice taking on the tone she was learning meant potential danger. "Go inside and stay there until I tell you it's safe." The child looked from Elias to the approaching riders, her dark eyes wide with the kind of fear that came from experience with unexpected visitors. Without argument, she slipped inside the cabin. Though Elias noticed, she positioned herself where she could see through the partially open door. Sheriff Jameson dismounted first, his movements carrying the reluctance of a man forced into an uncomfortable situation. The stranger followed, revealing himself to be a man in his 50s, with the soft features of someone unaccustomed to frontier hardships. His clothes were travel-stained but expensive, and his eyes held the calculating look of someone who viewed the world through the lens of profit and loss. "Afternoon, Boone," Jameson said, touching the brim of his hat. "Hope you don't mind the intrusion. This here's Mr. Cornelius Blackwood from back east. He's got some questions about the girl." Elias remained seated on the cabin steps, his posture deceptively relaxed, while every muscle in his body prepared for potential violence. "What kind of questions?" Blackwood stepped forward, his gaze sweeping over the modest cabin with obvious disdain. "Mr. Boone, I represent certain interests back in Philadelphia who have a legitimate concern regarding the child you've taken in. I understand her name is Sarah Mitchell." "That's what she told me," Elias replied carefully. "I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding," Blackwood continued, pulling a leather portfolio from his coat. "The child's real name is Sarah Margaret Whitmore. Her mother was Margaret Whitmore, formerly Margaret Blackwood, my deceased brother's daughter." The words hit Elias like a physical blow. Whitmore. The name echoed through his memory, bringing with it images he'd spent 5 years trying to forget. James Whitmore, a man Elias had known, a man whose death had sent him fleeing to these mountains in the first place. "You're saying Sarah is," Elias began, his voice rough with sudden understanding. "My grandniece," Blackwood finished. "Margaret married against the family's wishes, running off with that Whitmore fellow and cutting all ties with decent society. When word reached me that she'd been killed by bandits, along with her husband and presumed their child, I came west immediately to settle affairs." Sheriff Jameson shifted uncomfortably. "Mr. Blackwood's got legal documents, Boone. Seems he's the girl's closest living relative." Elias felt the world shifting beneath him like loose shale on a mountain slope. Sarah wasn't just an orphaned child he'd rescued. She was the granddaughter of James Whitmore, the man whose death had made Elias a wanted man. The irony was crushing. He'd taken in the child of the very people whose lives he'd destroyed through his own violent past. "Where exactly do you plan to take her?" Elias asked, his voice deadly quiet. "Back east, naturally. To Philadelphia, where she'll receive a proper education and upbringing befitting her station. The Blackwood family has considerable resources she'll want for nothing." Through the crack in the door, Elias caught sight of Sarah's pale face. She was listening to every word, her small hands pressed against the door frame. The terror in her eyes told him everything he needed to know about what she thought of this stranger's plans. "And if she doesn't want to go?" Blackwood's laugh was cold and dismissive. She's 6 years old, Mr. Boone. Children don't make such decisions for themselves. Besides, what could a place like this possibly offer her? Look around you. This is no environment for a young lady of good breeding. Elias stood slowly, his full height casting a shadow across the well-dressed stranger. This environment offers her safety, protection, someone who gives a damn whether she lives or dies. I'm sure your intentions are admirable, Blackwood said, though his tone suggested he doubted even that much. But the law is clear in matters of guardianship. Blood relatives take precedence over, he gestured vaguely at Elias, charitable strangers. Sheriff Jameson cleared his throat nervously. The man's got a point, Boone. Legal documents, family connections. Legal documents can be forged. Elias interrupted, his grey eyes never leaving Blackwood's face. Family connections can be lies. What proof do you have that you're who you claim to be? Blackwood's expression hardened. I have documentation, Mr. Boone. Birth certificates, family records, letters from Margaret before the unfortunate estrangement. More than enough to satisfy any court of law. Courts are a long way from here, Elias observed. The threat in his voice was unmistakable, and Blackwood took an involuntary step backward. Sheriff Jameson's hand moved toward his sidearm, a gesture that didn't go unnoticed by anyone present. Now hold on, Boone, Jameson said carefully. Let's keep this civilized. Mr. Blackwood's come a long way, and he's got legal standing. He's got papers, Elias corrected. That doesn't mean he's got the right to take a terrified child away from the only safety she's known since her parents died. The only safety? Blackwood's voice rose with indignation. Mr. Boone, you're a complete stranger to that child. You live alone in the wilderness, with no female supervision, no proper facilities for raising a young girl. How is that possibly in her best interests? Before Elias could respond, the cabin door opened and Sarah stepped out. Her small face was set with determination that seemed far too mature for her 6 years, and she clutched her mother's locket against her chest like a talisman. I don't want to go with you, she said clearly, her voice carrying across the clearing with surprising strength. I want to stay with Elias. Blackwood's expression softened into what he probably thought was grandfatherly kindness, but Elias could see the calculation behind the smile. My dear child, you don't understand. I'm your family, your mother's uncle. I knew your grandmother, your grandfather, your dear mother when she was just your age. Sarah studied him with those dark, serious eyes. Did you come looking for me when Mama and Papa died? The question caught Blackwood off guard. Well, of course, I came as soon as I heard. Elias came right away, Sarah interrupted. When everyone else was making excuses, he came and got me. He makes coffee for me in the morning and tells me stories about the mountains. He doesn't run away when I have nightmares. Child, you don't understand the opportunities. I understand that you want to take me away from someone who cares about me, to live with strangers who didn't even know I was alive until 3 days ago. Sarah's words carried a wisdom that seemed to surprise even herself. Elias felt something crack open in his chest, pride, protectiveness, and a fierce determination he hadn't experienced since his days as a soldier. This small girl, who'd lost everything, was willing to fight for the right to stay with him. She was choosing him over wealth, comfort, and social position because he'd shown her basic human kindness. The matter's settled, Blackwood announced, his patience clearly exhausted. Sheriff, I'll need you to enforce the legal requirements here. The child comes with me tomorrow morning. Jameson looked deeply uncomfortable. Now, Mr. Blackwood, maybe we could— Tomorrow morning, Blackwood repeated firmly. I have a schedule to keep, and frankly, I've seen enough of this wilderness to last a lifetime. He turned to Sarah with that false smile again. Pack your things, dear. You're going to love Philadelphia. There are theaters, museums, proper schools. No. Sarah's voice was quiet but absolute. She moved to stand beside Elias, her small hand finding his larger one. I'm not going anywhere. Blackwood's mask of patience finally slipped completely. You are a child, and you will do as you're told. This man, he gestured dismissively at Elias, is nothing to you, a temporary guardian at best, and frankly, given his reputation—" "What reputation?" Elias asked, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. "Oh, come now, Mr. Boone. Do you think I'd travel all this way without making inquiries? A man doesn't hide himself in the mountains for 5 years without reason. People talk, especially about dangerous men with mysterious pasts." Sheriff Jameson was looking increasingly nervous. "Maybe we should all calm down." "Did they tell you why I came to the mountains?" Elias asked, his grey eyes fixed on Blackwood with unnerving intensity. "I'm sure I don't care about the sordid details." "They should have told you," Elias continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Because if they had, you might have thought twice about coming here alone." The silence that followed was broken only by the mountain wind through the pines. Sarah looked up at Elias with concern, sensing the shift in his demeanor, but not understanding its source. She squeezed his hand, a gesture of support that seemed to anchor him to the present moment. "Threatening a lawful representative won't change the legal facts," Blackwood said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "Neither will legal documents change the moral facts," Elias replied. "That little girl has been through hell. She's found some peace here, some safety, and you want to drag her back east to live with people who've never shown the slightest interest in her welfare." "We didn't know she existed," Blackwood protested. "But you know now. And your first instinct isn't to ask what she needs or wants, it's to exercise your legal authority over her." Sarah tugged on Elias's hand. "What does he mean about taking me away tomorrow?" Elias knelt beside her, his large hands gentle on her shoulders. "He thinks he has the right to make you leave with him. But I want you to know something. I won't let anyone take you anywhere you don't want to go." "You don't have a choice in the matter," Blackwood snapped. "Sheriff, I expect your cooperation in this matter." Jameson looked from Blackwood to Elias to the small girl whose fate hung in the balance. "Maybe we could work something out, some kind of arrangement." "There's nothing to work out," Blackwood said coldly. "The law is clear." "Then the law's wrong," Elias said simply. As the sun began to set behind the mountain peaks, casting long shadows across the clearing, the battle lines were drawn. On one side stood wealth, social position, and legal authority. On the other stood a dangerous man and a determined child, bound together by nothing more than mutual need and the kind of love that grows in unexpected places. The confrontation that would determine Sarah's future was about to begin, and Elias Boone, the scary mountain man who'd spent 5 years running from his past, was finally ready to stand and fight. The visitors departed as the last light faded from the mountain peaks, but their presence lingered in the cabin like smoke from a poorly tended fire. Elias sat on the edge of his bed, methodically cleaning his hunting knife, while Sarah arranged her few possessions on the small table he'd cleared for her use. The blade gleamed in the firelight, 7 inches of steel that had saved his life more times than he cared to remember. "Are they really going to make me leave?" Sarah asked quietly, her small hands folding her extra dress with the careful precision of a child who'd learned that possessions were precious and fragile. Elias tested the knife's edge against his thumb, watching a thin line of blood appear. "Sharp enough." "Not if I have anything to say about it." "But they have papers, legal papers." She spoke the words like they were some kind of magic spell, powerful and incomprehensible. "Papers don't always mean what people think they mean," Elias replied, wiping the blade clean before sliding it back into its worn leather sheath. "Sometimes a man has to decide what's right, regardless of what's legal." Sarah climbed onto the chair beside him, her dark eyes studying his face with the intensity she brought to everything important. "You've had to make that choice before, haven't you?" The question caught Elias off guard. For 6 years old, Sarah had an uncanny ability to see straight through to the heart of things. "What makes you say that?" "The way you looked when that man was talking about your reputation. Like you were remembering something that hurt." She tilted her head thoughtfully, and the way you hold yourself when you think there might be trouble, like a soldier getting ready for battle. Elias felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. You're very observant for someone so young. Mama always said I watched too much and talked too little. She said it was because I was trying to figure out how the world worked. Sarah's voice grew wistful. I still don't understand most of it. The world's a complicated place, Elias admitted, full of people who do things for reasons that don't always make sense. Sometimes good people do bad things, and sometimes bad people do good things. Which kind are you? The directness of the question made Elias's chest tighten. How could he explain to a child that he'd once been a soldier, trained to kill efficiently and without hesitation? That he'd taken lives in service to his country, then taken more lives when the war ended and the lines between right and wrong had blurred beyond recognition? That James Whitmore, her grandfather, had died because of choices Elias had made in the heat of desperation and rage. I'm the kind of man who's made mistakes, he said finally. Bad ones, the kind that cost people their lives. Sarah considered this with the seriousness she brought to all their conversations. But you saved me. I didn't save you. I just gave you a place to stay. That's the same thing. Her certainty was absolute. When everyone else was making excuses, you chose to help me. That makes you good, even if you've done bad things before. Elias stood abruptly, unable to bear the weight of her faith in him. You should get some sleep. Tomorrow's going to be difficult. But Sarah wasn't ready to let the conversation end. Will you teach me to use a knife? The request was so unexpected that Elias turned back to stare at her. What? Your knife. Will you teach me how to use it? In case something happens and you're not there to protect me. The idea of putting a weapon in the hands of a 6-year-old should have been absurd, but Elias found himself considering it seriously. Sarah had already seen more violence than most adults. Her parents' murder had stripped away any illusions about the world's fundamental safety. Teaching her basic self-defense might be the most practical gift he could give her. A knife's not a toy, he said carefully. It's a tool that can save your life or end someone else's. You don't pick it up unless you're prepared to use it. I understand. Do you, really? Elias pulled the blade from its sheath again, holding it so the firelight played across the steel. This knife has killed men, Sarah. Men who were trying to hurt me, but men all the same. Once you cross that line, you can never go back to being the person you were before. Sarah's dark eyes never wavered from his. Those men you killed, were they trying to hurt innocent people? Some of them. Then you did what you had to do. That's what Mama always said. Sometimes we have to do hard things to protect the people we love. Her words echoed thoughts Elias had wrestled with through 5 years of mountain solitude. The moral complexities that had driven him to isolation seemed simpler through the lens of a child's understanding. Right and wrong weren't about legal documents or social conventions. They were about protecting the innocent and standing up to those who would cause harm. All right, he said quietly. I'll teach you, but we start with basic safety, not fighting techniques. Sarah's face lit up with the first genuine smile he'd seen since Blackwood's visit. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. Learning to handle a blade properly is harder than you might think. They spent the next hour going over knife safety, how to hold it properly, how to pass it to another person, how to clean and maintain the edge. Sarah listened with the focused attention of a student who understood that her life might depend on remembering every detail. Her small hands struggled with the weight and balance of the weapon, but she didn't complain or ask for an easier lesson. The most important thing, Elias explained, guiding her grip, is to never draw a weapon unless you're prepared to use it. A knife you're not willing to use is worse than no knife at all. It can be taken away and used against you. Like bluffing in poker. Where did you learn about poker? Papa used to play with the other men on the wagon train. He said bluffing was when you pretended to have something you didn't really have, hoping the other person would believe you. Elias nodded. Exactly like that. But with a knife, if someone calls your bluff, people die. When Sarah finally went to sleep on the small cot Elias had fashioned for her from pine logs and an old blanket, he remained by the fire, staring into the flames and thinking about the past that had followed him to this remote cabin. 5 years ago, he'd been Captain Elias Boone of the 3rd Colorado Cavalry, a man whose name was spoken with respect in military circles and fear in others. The war had ended, but men like Elias had found it difficult to return to civilian life when civilian life included carpetbaggers, corrupt officials, and predators who used the chaos of Reconstruction to line their own pockets. James Whitmore had been one of those predators, a businessman from Philadelphia who'd come west with federal backing and local political connections. He'd made his fortune buying up land from desperate settlers at a fraction of its value, then selling it to the railroad companies for massive profits. When Elias had tried to stop him when he'd confronted Whitmore about the families being driven from their homes, the encounter had turned violent. Elias had never intended to kill the man. A simple beating, a warning to leave honest folks alone, that had been the plan. But Whitmore had drawn a hidden derringer, and Elias's training had taken over. By the time the violence ended, James Whitmore was dead, and Elias was a wanted man with a price on his head. Now, through some cruel twist of fate, he was caring for Whitmore's granddaughter, the child of the man whose life he'd destroyed. The irony was crushing, but it also provided a strange kind of redemption. If he could protect Sarah, if he could give her the safety and love her grandfather's actions had cost so many other families, perhaps some balance could be restored to the universe. A soft sound from Sarah's cot drew his attention. She was murmuring in her sleep, caught in the grip of another nightmare. Elias moved quietly to her side, gently placing his hand on her shoulder. "Mama?" she whispered, her voice thick with sleep and sorrow. "It's all right," Elias said softly. "You're safe." Sarah's eyes opened, unfocused and frightened. "I dreamed they were coming back. The bad men who hurt Mama and Papa. They can't hurt you here. I won't let them." She sat up, her small arms reaching for him with the instinctive need for comfort that transcended their brief acquaintance. Elias hesitated for a moment, then gathered her into his arms, feeling the fragile weight of her trust settle around his shoulders like a mantle. "Elias," she whispered against his chest, "what is it? When I grow up, will you teach me to be as brave as you?" The question broke something open inside him. Here was a child who'd witnessed horrors that would traumatize grown men, yet she saw him as brave rather than dangerous. She looked up to him as a protector rather than fearing him as a killer. "You're already braver than I've ever been," he told her truthfully. "It takes real courage to trust someone, to open your heart after it's been broken. I've spent 5 years running from that kind of bravery." "You're not running anymore." "No," he agreed, feeling the truth of it settle into his bones. "I'm not running anymore." As Sarah drifted back to sleep in his arms, Elias made a silent promise to the mountain night. Whatever it took, whatever laws he had to break, whatever enemies he had to face, he would not let Cornelius Blackwood or anyone else take this child away from the only safety she'd known since her world collapsed. The scary mountain man was done running. Now it was time to fight. Dawn came too soon, painting the cabin walls with pale gold light that seemed to mock the gravity of the day ahead. Elias had barely slept, spending most of the night sitting by the window with his rifle across his knees, watching the trail for signs of approaching riders. Sarah had slept fitfully, waking twice more from nightmares that left her clinging to his hand like a lifeline. Now she sat at the small table, carefully stitching a new dress for her cloth doll with thread and fabric scraps Martha Henley had given her during their last trip to town. The doll was a pitiful thing, button eyes slightly crooked, yarn hair faded from years of love, but Sarah treated it with the reverence most people reserved for precious heirlooms. "Her name is Lucy," Sarah had explained on their first day together. "Mama made her for my 4th birthday. She said every little girl needed a friend who would never leave her." Watching Sarah's careful stitches, Elias understood that the doll represented more than childhood comfort. It was connection to her mother, proof that she had been loved, evidence that her life before the tragedy had contained joy and security. In a world that had suddenly become uncertain and dangerous, Lucy was the one constant Sarah could control. "That's beautiful work," Elias observed, settling beside her with 2 cups of coffee, his black and bitter, hers lightened with milk and sweetened with precious sugar. "Mama taught me. She said a lady should know how to make beautiful things with her hands." Sarah's needle moved with surprising skill for someone so young. "Do you think there are sewing circles in Philadelphia?" The question carried such casual heartbreak that Elias felt his chest tighten. Despite her brave words the night before, Sarah was already trying to prepare herself for the possibility that Blackwood might succeed in taking her away. "I don't know much about Philadelphia," Elias admitted, "but I imagine there are all kinds of activities for young ladies there." "I don't want to be a young lady. I want to stay here and learn about mountains and animals and how to sharpen knives properly." Sarah's voice carried the stubborn determination he was learning to associate with her most important declarations. "You can be both, you know. A young lady who knows how to take care of herself in the wilderness. Your mother was probably both refined enough for social situations, but strong enough to join a wagon train heading west." Sarah considered this possibility with the seriousness she brought to all new ideas. "Do you think Mama would be proud of me for choosing to stay with you instead of going with fancy relatives? I think your mother would be proud of you for thinking with your heart instead of just accepting what adults tell you is best for you." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses, multiple riders this time, moving with the steady pace of a planned expedition. Elias counted at least 4 sets of hoofbeats, possibly more. Blackwood had returned with reinforcements. "Sarah," Elias said quietly, his voice taking on the tone she'd learned meant immediate obedience was required. "Take Lucy and go to the hiding place we talked about. Stay there until I come for you, no matter what you hear." The hiding place was a small cave Elias had discovered during his first year on the mountain, a natural depression in the rock face, concealed by a tangle of mountain laurel and accessible only through a narrow opening that would be invisible to anyone who didn't know exactly where to look. They'd practiced the route twice yesterday, timing how long it took Sarah to reach safety from various points around the cabin. "What if you don't come?" Sarah asked, her dark eyes wide with the fear of abandonment that haunted every orphaned child. "I will come," Elias promised. "But if something happens, if I'm hurt or captured, you stay hidden until dark, then make your way down to town. Find Martha Henley. Tell her what happened." Sarah nodded gravely, clutching Lucy against her chest. "I love you, Elias." The words hit him like a physical blow. In 6 days, this small girl had gone from stranger to daughter, from burden to blessing. The love she offered was pure and uncomplicated, the kind of love that saw past scars and reputation to the man underneath. "I love you too, little one. Now go." Sarah slipped out the back of the cabin like a shadow, her small form disappearing into the forest with a skill that would have impressed seasoned scouts. Elias watched until she was completely hidden, then turned his attention to the approaching delegation. Blackwood rode at the head of the group, his expensive clothes now showing serious signs of trail wear. Beside him rode Sheriff Jameson, looking even more uncomfortable than he had the day before. Behind them came 3 men Elias didn't recognize hired guns by their look, with the hard eyes and easy postures of professionals accustomed to violence. The final rider was a surprise. Reverend Samuel Clark, his normally gentle face creased with concern. The preacher's presence suggested that someone in town had insisted on moral oversight of whatever Blackwood was planning. "Mr. Boone," Blackwood called out as the group reined in before the cabin, "I trust you've had time to reconsider our conversation yesterday." Elias stepped onto the cabin porch, his rifle held casually but ready. "I've had time to think about a lot of things. Where's Sarah?" That's precisely what we're here to discuss. The child needs to be turned over to my custody immediately. She's not property to be turned over, Elias replied evenly. She's a little girl who's been through hell, and she's finally found some peace. Why would anyone want to destroy that? Reverend Clark urged his horse forward slightly. Mr. Boone, I understand your attachment to the child, and I admire your willingness to help her. But Mr. Blackwood is family. Family that never bothered to check on her welfare until now, Elias interrupted. Family that wants to drag her away from everything familiar to satisfy their own convenience. One of the hired guns, a lean man with cold eyes and a tied-down holster, spoke up for the first time. Enough talk. Where's the kid? Elias's attention focused on the gunman with predatory intensity. And you are? Frank Morrison. Mr. Blackwood hired me and my associates to ensure this matter is resolved quickly and legally. Legally? Elias repeated. What's legal about hired killers threatening a child? Now see here, Blackwood began, but Morrison cut him off. Nobody's threatening anybody. We're just here to make sure there's no trouble when the girl's transferred to her rightful guardian. Her rightful guardian is the person she chooses to trust with her safety, Elias said, and she's made that choice clear. Children don't get to choose, Morrison replied. That's what adults are for. The conversation was interrupted by Sheriff Jameson, clearing his throat nervously. Maybe we could all calm down and discuss this reasonably. Nobody wants violence here. I certainly don't, Reverend Clark added quickly. Surely there's some compromise that would serve the child's best interests. Blackwood's patience was clearly exhausted. The only compromise is immediate compliance with legal authority. Mr. Morrison, search the cabin. Morrison dismounted smoothly, his hand resting on his gun butt as he approached the porch. Step aside, mountain man. Elias didn't move. You take one more step toward that door, and you'll find out why people call me dangerous. The threat hung in the mountain air like the tension before a thunderstorm. Morrison's hand moved closer to his weapon, while his two companions began to spread out, positioning themselves for a potential gunfight. Sheriff Jameson looked like he wanted to disappear entirely, while Reverend Clark began murmuring what sounded like prayers. Mr. Boone, Blackwood said coldly, you're outnumbered and outgunned. Be reasonable. Reasonable men don't hire killers to intimidate children, Elias replied, and they don't use legal documents to justify cruelty. Where is she? Morrison demanded, his patience clearly at an end. Somewhere safe. Not for long. Morrison's hand closed on his gun grip. Last chance to do this easy. Elias shifted slightly, bringing his rifle to a more aggressive position without actually aiming it. The movement was subtle but unmistakable, a professional's way of announcing that violence was imminent unless someone backed down. Frank, one of Morrison's companions, called out nervously. Maybe you should listen to your friend, Elias suggested quietly. Because if you draw that gun, you better be prepared to use it, and you better be faster than a man who's been living by his wits and his weapons for the past 5 years. The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring. Morrison was clearly considering his odds, weighing his professional reputation against the very real possibility that he was about to face someone more dangerous than anticipated. Blackwood watched with growing anxiety, perhaps beginning to realize that his simple plan to collect an orphaned child had evolved into something far more complex and dangerous. Then Reverend Clark's voice cut through the tension like a prayer answered, "Stop this madness, all of you." The normally gentle preacher's voice carried an authority that made even Morrison pause. This is not how Christian men resolve disputes over a child's welfare. The moment of hesitation was all Elias needed. Reverend's right. This isn't about legal documents or family connections. It's about what's best for Sarah. And what's best for her is staying with someone who actually cares about her happiness. I care about her future, Blackwood protested. Her education, her social position, her prospects for a proper marriage. You care about your family's reputation, Elias corrected. About having control over James Whitmore's granddaughter. The name hung in the air like a curse. Blackwood's face went pale, and Morrison's eyes sharpened with new interest. Even Sheriff Jameson seemed to sense that something significant had just been revealed. "You knew James," Blackwood said slowly. "You knew my nephew." "I knew him," Elias confirmed, his voice carrying the weight of old grief and older guilt. "I knew what kind of man he was, and what his business practices cost innocent families." Morrison's hand relaxed slightly on his gun. This just got a lot more interesting. But before anyone could pursue this revelation further, a small voice called out from the edge of the clearing. "Don't hurt him, please don't hurt Elias." Sarah stood at the tree line, Lucy clutched in her arms, her dark eyes filled with tears. Despite Elias's careful instructions, she'd been unable to stay hidden while the adults argued over her fate. "Sarah, no!" Elias called out, but she was already running toward the cabin, her small legs carrying her straight into the middle of the armed confrontation. "I won't go," she declared, throwing her arms around Elias's waist. "You can't make me. Elias is my family now." The sight of the small girl clinging to the mountain man seemed to deflate some of the tension from the standoff. Even Morrison looked uncomfortable, threatening a child who was obviously terrified. Blackwood dismounted and approached slowly, his hands spread to show he meant no immediate harm. "Sarah, my dear, you don't understand the situation. I'm your great-uncle Cornelius. Your mother was my brother's daughter." Sarah looked up at him with eyes that seemed far too old for her young face. "My mother never talked about you." "Well, there was a disagreement in the family, but that's in the past now. What matters is that you come home with me, where you belong." "I belong here," Sarah said firmly, "with Elias. He takes care of me." "Child, look around you." Blackwood gestured at the modest cabin, the rough furniture, the primitive conditions. "This is no place for a young lady. In Philadelphia, you'd have a proper house, servants, the finest schools." "I don't want servants. I want someone who loves me." The simple declaration seemed to hit Blackwood like a physical blow. For the first time since his arrival, he appeared genuinely shaken by the child's words. Reverend Clark dismounted and approached carefully. "Sarah, do you understand what Mr. Blackwood is offering? A chance for education, for a better life than—" "Better than what?" Sarah interrupted, her voice rising with passion. "Better than having someone who makes me feel safe? Better than someone who doesn't run away when I have nightmares? Better than someone who teaches me things and listens when I talk?" She turned to face the assembled men, her small frame trembling with emotion, but her voice steady with conviction. "My mama and papa are dead. Nothing's going to bring them back. But Elias makes me feel like I'm not alone in the world. He makes me feel like I matter." The words hung in the mountain air, carrying a truth that legal documents couldn't contradict. Here was a child who'd found love in the most unlikely place, safety with the most dangerous man in the territory, and family with someone who had no blood claim to her whatsoever. Morrison was the first to break the spell. "Touching story, kid, but the law's the law." But his heart didn't seem to be in the threat anymore. The sight of Sarah's obvious devotion to Elias had changed the dynamic of the confrontation in ways that threatened violence couldn't address. "Maybe," Sheriff Jameson said slowly, "we could work out some kind of arrangement. Visitation rights, shared custody." "Shared custody?" Blackwood's voice rose with indignation. "Sheriff, I didn't travel halfway across the continent to negotiate shared custody with a—" he gestured at Elias, "with whatever this man is." "This man," Sarah said clearly, "is my papa now, the papa I chose, and I'm not leaving him." The declaration settled over the clearing like morning mist, soft but encompassing. In choosing to call Elias Papa, Sarah had crossed a line that transformed their relationship from guardian and ward to father and daughter. It was a claim that transcended legal documents and blood relations, a claim of the heart that even hired guns couldn't easily dismiss. The confrontation ended not with gunfire but with grudging compromise, though the victory felt hollow to Elias as he watched Blackwood's party ride back down the mountain trail. Sheriff Jameson had negotiated a temporary truce. Sarah could remain with Elias for 1 week, while Blackwood consulted with legal authorities about his options. It was a reprieve, not a resolution, and everyone present understood that the real battle was yet to come. 3 days into that fragile week, Martha Henley arrived at the cabin, carrying a worn leather satchel and wearing the grim expression of someone bearing unwelcome news. Sarah was outside, feeding the handful of chickens Elias kept for eggs, her laughter mixing with the mountain birdsong as she scattered grain and spoke to each hen by name. "Elias," Martha said without preamble, settling heavily onto the cabin steps, "we need to talk." He joined her on the steps, noting the way her weathered hands trembled slightly as she opened the satchel. "What's wrong?" "Harold Grayson received a telegram yesterday. Seems Mr. Blackwood's been busy back in town, sending wires to Philadelphia and points east." She pulled out a folded paper, yellow with telegraph ink. This came in response. Elias took the paper, his heart sinking as he read the official language and legal terminology. It was a wanted poster, 5 years old but still valid, bearing his name and description. The charges were serious: murder in the 1st degree, assault with intent to kill, destruction of property. The reward was substantial enough to attract professional bounty hunters from 3 states. "So now they know," he said quietly, folding the paper and handing it back to Martha. "Now they know part of it," she corrected, "but not the whole story. Care to fill in the details?" Elias watched Sarah chase a particularly stubborn hen around the small yard, her dress muddy and her hair coming loose from its careful braids. She looked like any normal child enjoying a carefree afternoon, not an orphan caught in the middle of adult machinations and old vendettas. "James Whitmore was Sarah's grandfather," he said finally, "a businessman from Philadelphia who came west after the war to make his fortune buying up homesteads from desperate settlers. He had federal backing and local political connections, which made him essentially untouchable through legal channels." Martha's expression hardened. "I remember hearing about families being forced off their land around that time. Good people who'd worked themselves near to death trying to make a go of it. Whitmore would wait until they were desperate: crop failures, illness, anything that put them behind on payments or taxes. Then he'd swoop in with legal documents and armed men, offering to buy them out for a fraction of what the land was worth. If they refused, he'd find ways to make their lives impossible until they had no choice but to accept. And you tried to stop him." "I tried to reason with him first, told him what his business practices were doing to innocent families. Offered to help him find more legitimate ways to invest his money." Elias's voice carried the weight of old regret. He laughed at me, said sentiment was a luxury businessmen couldn't afford. Sarah had given up chasing the hen and was now sitting in the dirt, letting the chickens peck grain from her outstretched palms. Her trust in the simple creatures was absolute, her joy in their company genuine. It was impossible to reconcile this picture of innocence with the violent legacy that had brought her into Elias's life. "What happened next?" Martha asked gently. "I started documenting his activities, gathering evidence of fraud and intimidation. Thought maybe if I could present enough proof to the territorial authorities, they'd have to act." Elias shook his head at his own naivety. "Turns out Whitmore had bought more officials than I'd realized. So you took matters into your own hands." "I confronted him directly. Went to his hotel room in Denver, intending to convince him to leave the territory voluntarily." The euphemism felt inadequate, but Elias couldn't bring himself to describe the rage that had consumed him that night. The conversation got heated. He drew a gun. I reacted on instinct. By the time it was over, he was dead. Martha was quiet for a long moment, processing the information. Self-defense, then. That's what I told myself. But the truth is, I wanted to hurt him. I'd seen too many families destroyed by his greed, too many children left homeless because of his business practices. When he drew that gun, part of me was relieved to have an excuse to finish what I'd started. And now his granddaughter calls you Papa. The irony wasn't lost on Elias. The universe has a twisted sense of justice. Or maybe it has a perfect sense of redemption, Martha suggested. Maybe taking care of Sarah is your chance to balance the scales. Before Elias could respond, Sarah came running over with a brown egg, clutched carefully in her small hands. "Look, Bessie laid another one. That's 3 eggs today. We can have scrambled eggs for supper." Her excitement over such a simple thing reminded Elias of how little it took to make a child happy when she felt safe and loved. 3 eggs were a treasure to someone who'd learned not to take abundance for granted. "That's wonderful," Martha said warmly. "You're becoming quite the little farmer." Sarah beamed at the praise, then noticed the serious expressions on the adults' faces. "Is something wrong?" "We're just talking about grown-up things," Elias said carefully. "Nothing for you to worry about." But Sarah was too perceptive to be easily dismissed. Her dark eyes moved from Martha's tense posture to the folded paper in her lap, to Elias's guarded expression. "It's about Uncle Cornelius, isn't it? He's trying to make me leave again." Martha looked to Elias for guidance on how much truth a 6-year-old could handle. He made the decision to trust Sarah's strength, just as she'd trusted his. "Yes," he said simply. "He's found out things about my past that he thinks prove I'm not suitable to be your guardian." Sarah's chin lifted with the stubborn determination he'd come to recognize and admire. "What kind of things?" "Things I did before I came to the mountains, mistakes I made that hurt people." "Did you hurt innocent people?" The directness of her question caught him off guard. "I hurt people who were hurting others, but that doesn't make it right." Sarah considered this with the gravity she brought to all moral questions. Mama always said that sometimes good people have to do hard things to protect others. She said it was sad when that happened, but it didn't make the good people bad. Her words echoed the justifications Elias had wrestled with for 5 years. Coming from a child who'd witnessed the worst of human nature, they carried a weight that absolution from priests or politicians never could. "Your mama was a wise woman," Martha observed. "She was the best mama in the world," Sarah agreed. "And she would have liked Elias. She always said you could tell a person's heart by how they treated children and animals." As if to prove her point, one of the chickens had followed Sarah to the steps and was now pecking hopefully at her muddy boots. She reached down to stroke its feathers with the gentle touch of someone who understood that creatures deserved kindness simply because they were alive. "Sarah," Martha said carefully, "what would you say if I told you that some people in town think it would be better for you to go live with your uncle in Philadelphia?" "I'd say those people don't know what's better for me," Sarah replied without hesitation. "I'd say they're thinking about what looks proper instead of what feels right, even if it meant giving up the chance for a fancy education and a big house. Mama taught me to read and do sums. Elias is teaching me about the mountains and how to take care of myself. That seems like education to me." Sarah's logic was unassailable in its simplicity, and this cabin feels more like home than any big house ever could. Martha smiled despite the gravity of the situation. "You're a remarkable child, Sarah. Your parents would be very proud of the young lady you're becoming." "I hope so," Sarah said quietly. "I try to remember the things they taught me about being brave and kind and standing up for what's right. Sometimes standing up for what's right means making difficult choices," Elias said carefully, "even when those choices hurt people we care about." Sarah's dark eyes met his with understanding that seemed far beyond her years. "You're thinking about sending me away to keep me safe, aren't you?" The accuracy of her perception left Elias speechless. He had been considering exactly that, the possibility that his love for Sarah might require the ultimate sacrifice of letting her go, rather than subjecting her to the violence that seemed to follow him wherever he went. "I'm thinking about what's best for you," he said finally. "What's best for me is staying with you," Sarah said firmly. "Whatever trouble comes, we face it together. That's what families do." As the sun began to set behind the mountain peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Elias realized that the choice was no longer his to make. Sarah had claimed him as family, and families didn't abandon each other when times got difficult. Whatever consequences came from his past actions, whatever legal battles lay ahead, they would face them together. The wanted poster in Martha's lap was just paper and ink. The love between a dangerous man and a brave little girl was written in something far more permanent. The morning of their 5th day together began with an unexpected gift. Elias woke to find Sarah sitting at the small table, a hand-stitched primer spread before her as she carefully traced letters with her finger. The book was crude but functional pages cut from brown paper and sewn together with Martha Henley's precise stitches, filled with simple words and pictures drawn in careful ink. "Where did this come from?" Elias asked, settling beside her with his morning coffee. "I made it," Sarah said proudly. "Well, Martha helped with the sewing, but I wrote all the words and drew the pictures. It's for learning to read better." Elias examined the primer with growing amazement. Each page contained a different lesson letters, paired with simple drawings, basic words spelled out in Sarah's careful handwriting, short sentences that told stories about mountain life. The pictures were charmingly primitive but recognizable: a cabin among pine trees, a man with a rifle, a little girl feeding chickens. "This is remarkable work," he said honestly. "Your mother taught you well. She said reading was the most important thing a person could learn, because books hold all the knowledge in the world." Sarah's finger traced the outline of a drawing showing a man and child sitting by a fireplace. "I wanted to make sure I remembered everything she taught me so I could teach other people someday." The simple primer represented more than childhood education. It was Sarah's way of preserving her mother's legacy while building something new with Elias. Each carefully drawn picture and painstakingly spelled word was an act of faith in their future together. "Would you like me to read with you?" Elias asked. Sarah's face lit up with joy. "Would you? Mama and I used to read together every evening after supper." They spent the next hour working through the primer together, with Sarah reading the simple sentences aloud, while Elias helped with unfamiliar words. Her reading was surprisingly advanced for a 6-year-old, testament to her mother's dedication and her own quick mind. But more than that, it was a window into how she saw their life together. The stories she'd written were all about a mountain man and his daughter, learning from each other and facing challenges together. Their peaceful morning was interrupted by the sound of a single horse approaching at a gallop. Elias recognized the urgent pace immediately. Someone was bringing news that couldn't wait. He moved to the window, rifle in hand, while Sarah gathered her primer protectively against her chest. The rider was Deputy Tom Walsh, a young man whose nervous energy usually meant trouble was brewing in Cedar Ridge. He reined in before the cabin with the kind of barely controlled panic that came from being the bearer of very bad news. "Mr. Boone," Walsh called out, his voice carrying across the clearing. "Sheriff sent me to warn you. There's been developments." Elias stepped onto the porch, noting how the deputy's eyes kept darting to the tree line, as if he expected armed men to emerge at any moment. "What kind of developments?" "Bounty hunters. 3 of them rode into town this morning with proper legal documents and federal backing. They're asking questions about you, showing around that wanted poster." Walsh's voice dropped to an urgent whisper. "They're professionals, Mr. Boone. The kind of men who don't give up once they've got a scent." Elias felt the familiar chill of hunted prey, recognizing pursuit. "How long before they find the trail up here?" "Already found it. Sheriff Jameson's doing his best to slow them down with paperwork and bureaucratic delays, but they'll be heading up the mountain within the hour." Sarah appeared in the doorway, her young face grave with understanding. She'd heard enough adult conversations about danger to recognize the signs of imminent threat. "Are they coming to hurt Elias?" she asked Walsh directly. The deputy glanced nervously between Sarah and Elias. "They're coming to take him back east for trial, miss. That's all I can say." "Which means they're coming to take him away from me," Sarah said with the kind of clear-eyed perception that made adults uncomfortable. "And they don't care what happens to me after that." Walsh had no answer for such brutal honesty. He was a good man doing his job, but the complexities of family bonds forged in crisis were beyond his experience. "You need to run," Walsh continued, addressing Elias. "Take the high mountain trails, head north toward the territorial border. You've got maybe an hour's head start if you leave now." Elias looked at Sarah, seeing his own dilemma reflected in her dark eyes. Running meant abandoning the life they'd built together, but staying meant facing professional killers with a child caught in the crossfire. "What about Sarah?" he asked. "Mr. Blackwood's still in town. Sheriff figures the girl would go to him if when you're taken." "No," Sarah said firmly, stepping out onto the porch to stand beside Elias. "I won't go to him. I'll run away first." "Child, you can't," Walsh began. "I can, and I will," Sarah interrupted with absolute certainty. "I'd rather live in the mountains by myself than go with someone who doesn't love me." Her declaration hung in the morning air like a challenge to the adult world's assumptions about what was best for children. Here was a 6-year-old willing to risk everything: cold, hunger, wild animals, and worse, rather than accept safety without love. Elias knelt beside her, his large hands gentle on her small shoulders. "Sarah, listen to me. Running away alone isn't brave, it's dangerous. You could get hurt, or lost, or—" "Then take me with you," she said simply. "We'll run away together. I can't ask you to live that kind of life. Always moving, always hiding, never knowing if today's the day they catch up with us." Sarah's chin lifted with stubborn determination. "You're not asking, I'm choosing. Just like I chose to stay with you, instead of going with Uncle Cornelius." Deputy Walsh looked increasingly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "Mr. Boone, I hate to press, but time's running short. Those bounty hunters aren't the type to be delayed by bureaucracy for long." Elias stood slowly, his mind racing through possibilities and calculating odds. 3 professional bounty hunters against 1 man, with a child to protect. The mountain trails offered concealment, but also isolation if they were cornered. There would be no help coming. "There's another option," he said quietly. "I could surrender myself, make sure Sarah's safely placed with someone who'll care for her properly." "No," Sarah's voice cracked with emotion. "You promised you wouldn't leave me." "I promised I wouldn't let anyone take you somewhere you didn't want to go. This is different. This is you giving up." Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but her voice remained strong. "This is you deciding that their laws are more important than our family." Her words struck home with devastating accuracy. Elias had spent 5 years running from the consequences of his actions, telling himself he was protecting others when he was really protecting himself. Now, faced with the possibility of losing Sarah, he was ready to run again, or worse, to surrender and abandon her to the very people whose legal authority he'd been rejecting. "Sometimes adults have to make hard choices to protect the people they love," he said gently. "And sometimes," Sarah replied, "adults have to fight for the people they love." The wisdom in her words shamed him. Here was a child who'd lost everything but refused to accept defeat, who chose loyalty over safety and love over security. She was braver than he'd ever been, willing to face an uncertain future as long as they faced it together. "The hideout," he said suddenly, turning to Walsh. "How many people know about the old mining camp up on Devil's Ridge?" Walsh's eyes widened. "The abandoned silver mine? Nobody's been up there in years. Trails barely passable. But it's defensible. Good sightlines, limited approaches, water source." Elias was already calculating supplies and defensive positions. "If we could make it there." "You're talking about a siege," Walsh said nervously. "Mr. Boone, those bounty hunters have federal authority. If you resist arrest, if I surrender, Sarah becomes a pawn in Blackwood's games. If I run, she becomes either a fugitive or an orphan, again." Elias's voice carried the weight of a man who'd finally stopped running from his choices. "But if we make a stand, if we force them to negotiate, instead of just taking what they want." "You'll force them to use violence," Walsh finished. "Maybe, or maybe We'll force them to find a better solution." Sarah moved to stand beside him, her small hand finding his larger one. "If we're going to fight, we should probably get started." Her matter-of-fact acceptance of their situation would have been heartbreaking if it weren't so inspiring. This child had already survived the worst tragedy imaginable and emerged with her capacity for love intact. If she was willing to trust him with her future, he owed it to her to stop running from his past. "Deputy," Elias said formally, "tell Sheriff Jameson that we've gone up to Devil's Ridge. Tell him we're not looking for trouble, but we won't be taken without Sarah's future being properly settled." "And tell him," Sarah added with 6-year-old gravity, "that families stick together, no matter what." As Deputy Walsh rode back down the mountain to deliver their message, Elias and Sarah began gathering supplies for what might be their final stand together. The primer she'd made that morning went into the pack alongside ammunition and dried food, because even in the face of overwhelming odds, hope for the future was worth carrying. The old mining camp at Devil's Ridge sat like a scar on the mountainside, its weathered buildings testimony to dreams of wealth that had died with the silver vein 20 years earlier. Elias and Sarah reached the abandoned settlement as the afternoon sun began its descent toward the western peaks, their horses blown from the steep climb, but their spirits still determined. The camp offered everything Elias had hoped for: elevated position, clear sightlines down multiple approaches, and buildings that could provide cover while allowing defensive fire. What he hadn't expected was to find it already occupied. An elderly man emerged from the largest cabin as they approached, his white hair wild and his clothes patched but clean. He moved with the careful steps of someone whose joints remembered harder winters than most people could imagine. But his eyes were sharp and alert. "Well, I'll be damned," the old man said, his voice carrying the rough music of a lifetime spent in the mountains. "Elias Boone, as I live and breathe." Elias dismounted cautiously, his hand near his weapon, until recognition dawned. "Ezra McKinnon, I thought you were dead." "Reports of my demise have been greatly exaggerated," Ezra replied with a grin that revealed several missing teeth. "Though I can't say the same for my reputation. Who's the young lady?" Sarah slid down from her horse with the confidence of a child who'd grown comfortable with mountain travel. "I'm Sarah. Elias is my papa." Ezra's eyebrows rose at this announcement, but he accepted it with the equanimity of someone who'd seen enough of life to know that families came in many forms. "Pleased to meet you, Miss Sarah. Welcome to my humble estate. I have them." "Your estate?" Elias looked around at the collection of dilapidated buildings. "I thought this place was abandoned." "Officially, it is. Unofficially, I've been using it as a base of operations for the past 3 years. Ezra's expression grew serious. "Ever since I found out the truth about James Whitmore," the name hit Elias like a physical blow. "What truth?" "That he wasn't working alone, that his land-grabbing operation was part of something much bigger, much more organized." Ezra gestured toward the main cabin. "Come inside. There's something you need to see." The interior of the cabin was a revelation. What had appeared to be the simple shelter of an aging hermit was actually the headquarters of a meticulous investigation. Maps covered the walls, marked with pins and colored thread, connecting various locations. Tables held stacks of documents, correspondence, and detailed notes written in Ezra's careful script. "My God," Elias breathed, taking in the scope of the operation. "How long have you been working on this?" "Ever since my grandson was killed trying to defend his homestead from Whitmore's men." Ezra's voice carried the quiet fury of a man who'd spent years planning revenge. Tommy was only 19, fresh back from the war and full of dreams about making his own way in the world. Whitmore's thugs shot him down like a dog when he refused to sign over his land. Sarah moved closer to Elias, sensing the pain and anger that filled the room like smoke. Her small hand slipped into his, offering comfort while seeking reassurance. "I'm sorry," Elias said quietly. "I didn't know." No reason you should have. Tommy was just one of dozens of people who died because they stood between James Whitmore and easy money. Ezra pulled out a thick folder, its contents spilling across the table. But here's what I've learned in 3 years of investigation. Whitmore was just a front man. The documents told a story of corruption that reached far beyond one man's greed. Whitmore had been part of a syndicate of Eastern investors who'd used the chaos of Reconstruction to systematically loot the frontier territories. They'd employed legal manipulation, political bribery, and outright violence to acquire millions of acres of land at a fraction of its value, then sold it to railroad companies and mining consortiums for enormous profits. Look at this, Ezra said, spreading out a map marked with red pins. Every one of these locations represents a family that was driven off their land by Whitmore's operation. Hundreds of homesteads, thousands of people displaced or killed. Elias studied the map with growing horror. The scope of the operation was staggering, a coordinated campaign of theft and murder that had devastated entire communities. The territorial authorities had to know, he said. They did know. Some were paid to look the other way, others were threatened into silence. Ezra pulled out another folder. But here's the real revelation. James Whitmore tried to get out. What? 6 months before his death, Whitmore started having second thoughts about the operation. Maybe it was conscience, maybe it was fear of getting caught, but he began documenting everything: names, dates, financial records, correspondence with his Eastern backers. Ezra handed Elias a letter, written in James Whitmore's careful script. The paper was yellowed with age, but the words were clear. A detailed confession of the land syndicate's activities and a plea for federal intervention to stop the operation. He was going to turn state's evidence, Elias realized. More than that, he was going to testify before a federal grand jury, expose the whole operation from top to bottom. Ezra's expression was grim. That's why they had him killed. The words hit Elias like a thunderbolt. They? Who's they? His own partners, the Eastern investors who'd been funding the operation. They couldn't risk exposure, so they decided to eliminate the threat. Ezra pulled out a final document, a telegram dated 2 weeks before Whitmore's death. This is the order for his assassination, sent from Philadelphia to a hired killer named Frank Morrison. Sarah gasped, recognizing the name from their recent confrontation. That's one of the men who came with Uncle Cornelius. Elias felt the world shift beneath him as the implications became clear. Morrison wasn't hired to collect Sarah. He was hired to finish what he started 5 years ago. And Cornelius Blackwood? Ezra asked. James Whitmore's business partner, Elias said slowly. Probably one of the investors who ordered the assassination in the first place. The truth was stunning in its simplicity and horrifying in its implications. Elias hadn't killed an innocent businessman in a moment of rage. He'd killed a man who was trying to expose a massive criminal conspiracy. And now that same conspiracy was using Sarah as bait to draw him out of hiding so they could eliminate the only witness to Whitmore's murder. They've been looking for you for 5 years, Ezra continued. Not for justice, but to tie up loose ends. You're the only person who can testify that Whitmore was murdered, not killed in some random act of frontier violence. Sarah's young face was pale with understanding. Uncle Cornelius doesn't want to take care of me. He wants to use me to catch Elias. I'm afraid so, child. Your grandfather was trying to do the right thing when he died, but there are powerful people who don't want that truth to come out. Elias sank into a chair, overwhelmed by the weight of revelation. For 5 years, he'd carried the guilt of James Whitmore's death, believing himself a murderer who'd let anger override justice. Now he learned that Whitmore had died not because of Elias's violence, but because he'd tried to expose the very crimes Elias had been fighting against. There's more, Ezra said gently, about Sarah's mother. Margaret? Sarah looked up with sudden attention. What about Mama? Ezra's expression grew even more grave. Your mother didn't die in a random bandit attack, child. She was murdered because she inherited her father's evidence against the syndicate. The revelation was devastating. Sarah's parents hadn't been victims of frontier violence. They'd been targeted for assassination because Margaret Whitmore had possessed documents that could destroy a criminal conspiracy reaching into the highest levels of Eastern society. The men who killed your parents were the same men who've been hunting Elias, Ezra continued. Morrison and his associates have been systematically eliminating anyone connected to James Whitmore's investigation. Sarah's small hand gripped Elias's fingers with desperate strength. But I'm connected to it too. If they find me, they won't stop with just taking you back east, Elias finished grimly. Eventually, you'd become too much of a risk to leave alive. The hidden family Bible that Ezra produced from his collection of evidence contained the final piece of the puzzle. James Whitmore had hidden his most damning documents inside the hollowed-out cover, along with a letter addressed to his granddaughter. My dearest Sarah, the letter began in Whitmore's careful script. If you are reading this, then the worst has happened, and those I trusted have betrayed that trust. I pray that you will forgive an old man's crimes and understand that I tried in the end to make amends for the terrible things I helped set in motion. The letter went on to detail James Whitmore's growing horror at the syndicate's methods, his decision to gather evidence against his partners, and his desperate attempt to find federal authorities who weren't already corrupted by Eastern money and influence. I have hidden copies of all relevant documents in locations known only to me. The letter continued. Should anything happen to your parents and myself, these records represent the only hope of bringing justice to those we have wronged. The bearer of this letter, whoever they may be, should know that the truth is worth any price we might pay for it. Sarah's dark eyes were bright with tears as Ezra finished reading. Grandpa James was trying to be good at the end. He was, Elias said gently, finally understanding the full scope of the tragedy that had brought them together. He died, trying to protect innocent people, just like your parents did. And now, it's up to us to finish what they started, Ezra said, his weathered face set with determination. The evidence is all here, financial records, correspondence, witness statements from survivors of the land grab operation. Enough to destroy the entire syndicate and bring justice for hundreds of victims. The sound of approaching horses interrupted their conversation. Through the cabin's grimy windows, they could see riders moving up the mountain trail, at least 6 men, moving with the practiced formation of a military unit. Morrison's found us, Elias said grimly, checking his rifle. Actually, Ezra replied with a grim smile, I think Morrison's about to find more than he bargained for. The old prospector moved to a wooden chest in the corner of the cabin, throwing it open to reveal an arsenal that would have impressed a cavalry unit. Rifles, ammunition, dynamite, and other tools of frontier warfare filled the container to overflowing. I've been preparing for this confrontation for 3 years, Ezra explained, passing weapons to Elias. Ever since I realized that legal justice wasn't possible, I've been planning for frontier justice. Sarah moved to the window, her young face serious as she watched the approaching riders. There are more coming from the other direction. At least 4 more men. 10 against 3, Elias calculated. And one of us is a child. 10 professional killers against 2 angry grandfathers and 1 very determined little girl, Ezra corrected. I like our odds. Grandfathers. Sarah looked confused. Your grandfather James and my grandson Tommy, Ezra explained. We're fighting for them as much as for ourselves. The approaching riders had spread out, surrounding the mining camp with practiced efficiency. Morrison's voice carried across the clearing, amplified by the mountain air. Boone, we know you're in there. Come out with the girl and nobody else has to get hurt. Nobody else? Ezra called back mockingly. What about us? You're harboring a fugitive and interfering with federal authorities. That makes you accomplices. Federal authorities? Elias shouted. You're hired killers working for the same people who murdered James Whitmore. The accusation seemed to catch Morrison off guard. There was a long pause before he responded. You're talking nonsense, Boone. James Whitmore died in a fight with you 5 years ago. James Whitmore died, trying to expose a criminal conspiracy that reaches all the way back to Philadelphia, and you were the one who pulled the trigger. Sarah moved to stand beside Elias, her small voice carrying clearly across the clearing. My grandpa was a good man, trying to do the right thing, and you killed my mama and papa because they had his papers. Another pause, longer this time. When Morrison spoke again, his voice had lost some of its confident authority. The girl's confused, traumatized by everything she's been through. The girl knows exactly what happened, Ezra called out, and so do we. We have all of James Whitmore's evidence, Morrison. Every document, every financial record, every piece of correspondence that proves what you and your employers have been doing. Even if that's true, it doesn't matter. Dead men don't testify. But living witnesses do, a new voice called from the tree line, and federal marshals take a very dim view of hired killers impersonating lawmen. The voice belonged to a man in a dark coat and badge who emerged from concealment with 6 deputies, their weapons trained on Morrison's men. The leader was a tall, lean man with steel-gray hair and the kind of weathered authority that came from decades of honest law enforcement. U.S. Marshal William Hayes, the man announced. Mr. Morrison, you and your associates are under arrest for conspiracy, murder, and impersonating federal officers. Morrison's response was swift and violent. Instead of surrendering, he wheeled his horse and opened fire on the marshals, his men following suit. The mining camp erupted in gunfire as 3 separate forces, Morrison's hired killers, the federal marshals, and the defenders in the cabin, began what would become known as the Battle of Devil's Ridge. "Sarah, get down!" Elias shouted, pulling her behind an overturned table as bullets shattered the cabin windows. But Sarah had already moved, clutching her grandfather's hidden Bible against her chest. The truth that had cost so many lives was finally going to see the light of day, and she was determined that nothing would stop it. The final confrontation that would determine the fate of James Whitmore's investigation and Sarah's future had begun. The gunfight raged for nearly an hour before Marshal Hayes called for a temporary ceasefire. The mining camp looked like a battlefield. Bullet holes pocked every wooden surface, broken glass glittered in the afternoon sun, and smoke from burning buildings drifted across the clearing like fog. 3 of Morrison's men were down, 2 marshals were wounded, and Ezra had taken a bullet in the shoulder that left his left arm useless. "This is insane," Hayes shouted across the clearing. "Morrison, your position is hopeless. Surrender now, and I guarantee you'll live to stand trial." Morrison's reply was another volley of gunfire that sent the marshal diving for cover behind a pile of mining equipment. The hired killer was cornered and knew it, but men like Morrison didn't surrender. They fought until someone killed them, or they killed everyone else. Inside the main cabin, Elias checked Ezra's wound while Sarah carefully organized the documents they'd been protecting. The old prospector's shoulder was bleeding heavily, but the bullet had passed through without hitting bone. "I've had worse," Ezra insisted, though his face was pale with pain and blood loss. "During the war, I took shrapnel at Shiloh that laid me up for 3 months. This is just a scratch." "This scratch is going to get infected if we don't get you to a doctor," Elias replied, wrapping the wound with strips torn from his shirt. Sarah looked up from her careful arrangement of papers. "Will the marshal men take the evidence to the right people?" "If we can get it to them," Elias said. "Marshal Hayes seems like the real thing. But we need to make sure these documents reach federal prosecutors who can't be bought or intimidated." The pocket watch that had belonged to Elias's father, a timepiece that had survived 3 wars and 40 years of frontier life, showed that evening was approaching. The fading light would give them better concealment, but it would also make it harder for the marshals to maintain their positions around Morrison's men. "We need to end this soon," Ezra said, his voice growing weaker. "I'm losing too much blood to be much help in a prolonged fight." "You've done enough," Elias told him. "More than enough. Tommy would be proud of what you've accomplished here. Tommy would be proud that we're finally going to get justice for all those families." Ezra's eyes fixed on Sarah with grandfatherly affection. "And he'd be proud that we're protecting this brave little girl." Sarah abandoned her document, organizing to crawl over and take Ezra's good hand in both of hers. "Thank you for helping us. Grandpa James would be grateful that you found the truth about what happened. Your grandfather was a good man who made bad choices, then tried to make them right," Ezra said gently. "That's more than most of us manage in a lifetime." Another burst of gunfire interrupted their conversation, followed by Marshal Hayes's voice calling out terms for Morrison's surrender. The marshal was clearly a patient man, willing to negotiate rather than risk unnecessary casualties, but Morrison's increasingly erratic responses suggested that patience wouldn't be enough. "He's not going to surrender," Elias observed. "Men like Morrison know that capture means execution. He'll fight until he's dead, or we are." "Then we need to give him a reason to stop fighting," Sarah said quietly. Both men looked at her with surprise. "What do you mean?" Elias asked. "Uncle Cornelius is still down in town, right? He's probably the one paying Mr. Morrison and his men. If we could get word to the marshal about Uncle Cornelius, maybe they could arrest him too." The simple logic of a 6-year-old had identified the heart of their problem. Morrison was fighting desperately because he knew his employers would abandon him the moment he was captured. But if Blackwood were arrested simultaneously, Morrison might realize that cooperation offered his only chance of survival. "Sarah's right," Ezra said admiringly. "Cut off the head and the snake dies. If we can coordinate with the marshals to take Blackwood into custody, Morrison might be willing to testify against his employers in exchange for his life," Elias finished. But coordinating with the marshals required communication, and communication required someone leaving the relative safety of the cabin to cross a bullet-swept clearing. It was exactly the kind of dangerous mission that Elias would have undertaken without hesitation 5 years ago, but now he had Sarah to consider. "I could do it," Sarah offered with the matter-of-fact bravery that had become her trademark. "I'm small enough to move without being seen, and Mr. Morrison wouldn't shoot a little girl." "Absolutely not," Elias said firmly. "Morrison would absolutely shoot a little girl if he thought it would help him escape. You're staying right here where I can protect you. But someone has to." "Someone will, but not you." Their argument was interrupted by a new sound, the ringing of the old mining camp's bell. Someone was pulling the rope with rhythmic determination, sending the bronze bell's voice echoing across the mountainside. The gunfire stopped as everyone tried to determine who was making the sound and why. "That's coming from the assay office," Ezra said, pointing toward a small building at the edge of the camp. "But that's behind Morrison's position." Through the cabin window, they could see a figure moving purposefully around the assay office, an elderly woman in a dark dress who seemed completely oblivious to the bullets that had been flying minutes earlier. "Martha," Elias breathed, recognizing the determined stride and iron-gray hair of Martha Henley. "What's she doing here?" Sarah asked, pressing her face against the window for a better view. Their question was answered when Martha's voice carried across the clearing, amplified by a speaking trumpet she'd apparently brought for the occasion. "Frank Morrison," she called out, with the authority of a schoolteacher addressing an unruly class. "Frank Morrison, you stop this nonsense right now and listen to what I have to say." The sheer audacity of the interruption seemed to shock everyone into temporary silence. Morrison's voice, when it came, carried a note of bewildered irritation. "Lady, you need to get out of here before you get killed." "Young man, I am Martha Henley, and I have been dealing with troublemakers longer than you've been alive. Now you and your associates are going to put down your weapons and surrender to Marshal Hayes, or you're going to have to answer to me." Despite everything, Elias found himself smiling at Martha's fearless intervention. Here was a woman who'd buried 2 husbands and raised 4 children in frontier conditions, and she was treating professional killers like misbehaving schoolboys. "Mrs. Henley," Marshal Hayes called out, "please move to safety. These men are extremely dangerous." "Marshal Hayes, these men are bullies, and I've been dealing with bullies all my life. The trick is not to let them think they're in charge. Martha's appearance seemed to galvanize everyone into action. She was clearly non-combatant, but her presence added an element of moral authority that changed the entire dynamic of the confrontation. Moreover, her speaking trumpet meant that everyone within a mile could hear whatever she chose to say. "Frank Morrison," she continued, "I know all about your arrangement with Cornelius Blackwood. I know you're being paid to kill Elias Boone and that poor little girl, and I know that Blackwood and his associates murdered Sarah's parents." The public accusation carried across the mountainside like thunder. Morrison could no longer pretend this was a simple matter of law enforcement. Martha had stripped away the pretense and revealed the confrontation for what it really was. "You don't know anything about," Morrison began, but Martha cut him off. "I know that Cornelius Blackwood is currently in Sheriff Jameson's custody, arrested on federal charges of conspiracy and murder. I know that his associates in Philadelphia have already been taken into custody by federal agents, and I know that you and your men are fighting for employers who can no longer pay you." The revelation hit Morrison's position like a bombshell. If Blackwood had indeed been arrested, then Morrison was fighting not for money but for nothing. His employers couldn't protect him if they were themselves in federal custody. "She's lying," Morrison shouted, but his voice carried less conviction than before. "Martha Henley has never told a lie in her life." Marshal Hayes called back, "Morrison, your situation has changed. Surrender now and cooperate with federal authorities, and you might live to see another Christmas." Inside the cabin, Sarah was practically bouncing with excitement. "Martha came to save us. She's like a fairy godmother with a speaking trumpet. She's like a force of nature with a sense of justice," Ezra corrected admiringly. "That woman is magnificent." But Elias was watching Morrison's position with growing concern. Desperate men made dangerous choices, and a cornered killer might decide that if he couldn't escape, he could at least take his enemies with him. "Get ready," he told Sarah and Ezra quietly. "This is either going to end very quickly, or it's about to get much worse." The pocket watch in his vest showed that sunset was only minutes away. Whatever happened next would determine not just their survival, but whether the truth about James Whitmore's investigation would finally see justice or die with them in an abandoned mining camp on a Colorado mountainside. Morrison's surrender came not with a white flag, but with a small silver whistle, the kind children used for games and emergencies. Sarah had kept it hidden in her dress pocket since their flight from the cabin, a simple toy that her mother had given her years earlier. Now, as Morrison made his desperate final move, that whistle became the signal that saved all their lives. The hired killer had decided that if he couldn't escape, he would at least complete his mission. Using the gathering darkness as cover, he'd managed to circle around the marshal's positions and approach the main cabin from the blind side. His plan was simple: kill Elias Boone and Sarah, then fight his way out in the confusion that followed. Sarah saw him first, a shadow moving wrong against the starlight, a predator approaching their sanctuary with deadly intent. Without hesitation, she put the whistle to her lips and blew 3 sharp blasts that cut through the mountain air like alarm bells. The warning came just in time. Elias spun toward the cabin's rear window as Morrison kicked in the door, rifle raised and finger on the trigger. The 2 men fired simultaneously, their weapons lighting up the cabin interior with muzzle flashes that turned everything into stark black and white. Morrison's shot splintered the wall where Elias's head had been a second earlier. Elias's shot took Morrison's center mass, spinning the hired killer around and sending his rifle clattering across the floor. But Morrison wasn't finished, wounded and dying. He drew his sidearm with the mechanical precision of a professional killer who'd never learned to quit. "Sarah, down!" Elias shouted, but the little girl was already moving. Instead of diving for cover, she launched herself across the cabin to where her grandfather's hidden Bible lay among the scattered evidence. Morrison's second shot missed her by inches, the bullet embedding itself in the wooden wall where she'd been standing. Ezra, despite his wounded shoulder, managed to bring his rifle to bear just as Morrison aimed for his third and final shot. The old prospector's bullet took the hired killer high in the chest, ending Frank Morrison's long career of violence in the flickering light of a mountain cabin. The silence that followed the gunfire was broken only by Sarah's quiet sobbing as she clutched the Bible against her chest. She wasn't crying from fear or pain, but from the overwhelming relief of survival and the weight of everything she'd witnessed. "Is it over?" she whispered. "It's over," Elias confirmed, pulling her into his arms while keeping his rifle ready in case Morrison's associates tried to continue the fight. But the remaining hired guns had apparently decided that their leader's death released them from their obligations. Marshal Hayes's voice carried across the clearing, announcing the surrender of Morrison's surviving men and the end of the siege. "Mr. Boone, are you and the child safe?" "We're safe, Marshal," Elias called back. "Morrison's dead." "Good, stay where you are, we're coming to you." Within minutes, the cabin was filled with federal marshals, their badges and authority finally legitimate instead of forged. Marshal Hayes was a man in his 50s with the kind of weathered competence that came from decades of honest law enforcement. He took in the scene, the wounded Ezra, the blood-spattered walls, the evidence scattered across every surface, with the professional assessment of someone who'd seen too much violence but never became callous to its cost. "Miss Sarah," he said gently, kneeling to her level, "are you hurt?" "No, sir," Sarah replied politely, though she remained close to Elias's side. "But Mr. Ezra needs a doctor for his shoulder." "We'll take care of him," Hayes promised. "Can you tell me what happened here?" Sarah's account of the events was clear and precise, delivered with the kind of detailed observation that impressed the hardened lawman. She explained about her grandfather's evidence, Ezra's investigation, Morrison's true mission, and the conspiracy that had cost so many lives. "This child has been through hell," Hayes said quietly to Elias. "But she's got the backbone of a natural-born witness. Her testimony, combined with all this evidence, should be more than enough to bring down the entire syndicate." "What about Blackwood?" Elias asked. "Already in custody, along with 6 associates in Philadelphia. Turns out the federal government has been investigating this land syndicate for months. We just needed someone with inside knowledge to help us put the pieces together." Ezra, despite his weakness from blood loss, managed a satisfied smile. 3 years of work finally paying off. "Mr. McKinnon, your investigation was extraordinary. Without your documentation, we might never have been able to connect all the crimes to their source." Hayes studied the evidence with professional appreciation. "How did you manage to gather all this without being detected?" "I'm just a crazy old prospector," Ezra replied with mock innocence. "Nobody pays attention to crazy old prospectors." As the marshals began collecting evidence and preparing for the journey back to civilization, Sarah tugged on Elias's sleeve. "What happens now?" It was the question that had been haunting him since the moment Martha announced Blackwood's arrest. With the immediate danger past and the conspiracy exposed, Sarah's future was once again uncertain. She was still an orphaned child in need of proper care, and he was still a man with a violent past and an uncertain future. "I don't know," he admitted honestly, "but whatever happens, we'll face it together." Marshal Hayes overheard the exchange and approached them with the careful manner of someone delivering important news. "Mr. Boone, there are some things you should know about your legal situation." Elias felt his chest tighten. "What kind of things?" "The original charges against you for James Whitmore's death have been dropped. New evidence suggests that Whitmore was already mortally wounded when you encountered him, probably shot by Morrison or one of his associates. Your confrontation with Whitmore was actually an attempt to get help for an injured man. The revelation was stunning. But I remember the fight, the violence. You remember trying to help a man who was already dying and who used his last moments to try to get his evidence to safety." Hayes pulled out a blood-stained document. "We found this letter in Whitmore's coat. He was carrying it the night he died, along with some of the most damning evidence against his former partners. The letter was addressed to territorial authorities, begging for protection in exchange for testimony against the land syndicate. James Whitmore hadn't been the villain. Elias remembered he'd been a frightened man, trying to do the right thing in the face of almost certain death. "So, Elias isn't in trouble anymore?" Sarah asked hopefully. "Mr. Boone is considered a hero," Hayes replied. "His willingness to protect you and preserve this evidence has been instrumental in exposing one of the largest criminal conspiracies in territorial history." Sarah's face lit up with pure joy. "Does that mean we can go home?" "That depends on what Mr. Boone considers home," Hayes said diplomatically. The town bell of Cedar Ridge rang with celebration as the marshal's caravan descended from Devil's Ridge, its bronze voice carrying news of justice and resolution across the valley. Word had spread quickly through the small community. The scary mountain man had been vindicated, the criminals had been captured, and the little girl who'd stolen everyone's hearts was finally safe. But the real emotional climax came not in the streets of Cedar Ridge, but in the simple ceremony that took place 3 days later in Reverend Clark's small church. The building was packed beyond capacity, with townspeople spilling out onto the wooden steps and gathering around the open windows to witness something unprecedented in frontier history. Sarah Margaret Whitmore stood before the altar in a new dress that Martha Henley had sewn, especially for the occasion, blue calico, with tiny white flowers that matched the ribbons in her carefully braided hair. Beside her, Elias Boone wore his only good suit, a simple black ensemble that made him look less like a dangerous mountain man and more like what he was about to become, a father. The legal adoption papers had been processed with unprecedented speed, thanks to Marshal Hayes's intervention and the federal government's gratitude for Elias's role in exposing the land syndicate. There had been no objections from surviving relatives. Cornelius Blackwood was in federal prison awaiting trial, and no other family members had stepped forward to claim responsibility for Sarah's care. "Dearly beloved," Reverend Clark began, his gentle voice carrying easily through the crowded church. "We are gathered here today not just to witness a legal proceeding, but to celebrate the formation of a family born from love, tested by adversity, and blessed by providence." The ceremony was simple but profound. Sarah spoke her acceptance of Elias as her father with the same clear conviction she'd shown throughout their ordeal. Elias spoke his promise to protect, provide for, and love Sarah as his own daughter with a voice that carried the weight of absolute commitment. When the final papers were signed and witnessed, Sarah threw her arms around Elias's neck with pure joy. "Now it's official. You're really my papa." The congregation erupted in applause, but the sound was overshadowed by the ringing of the town bell, Martha Henley's way of announcing to the entire valley that Cedar Ridge had just gained its newest permanent family. Outside the church, the celebration continued with a community feast that stretched along the main street. Tables groaned under the weight of food contributed by every family in town, while children ran between the adults and musicians tuned their instruments for an evening of dancing and storytelling. But for Elias and Sarah, the most meaningful moment came when they found themselves alone for a few minutes on the church steps, watching their neighbors celebrate around them. "Are you happy?" Elias asked, though Sarah's radiant smile made the question unnecessary. "I'm the happiest I've been since Mama and Papa died," she said honestly. "But I think I'm different happy than I was before." "Different how?" Sarah considered the question with the seriousness she brought to all important thoughts. "Before, I was happy because everything was safe and easy. Now, I'm happy because everything is right." Her words captured something essential about their journey together, the transformation from simple contentment to deep satisfaction, from passive happiness to joy, earned through struggle and choice. "I feel the same way," Elias admitted, "like I've finally found where I belong." "We both found where we belong," Sarah corrected, "together." Their quiet moment was interrupted by Martha Henley, who approached with the determined stride of someone on a mission. In her hands, she carried a wrapped package that she presented to Sarah with ceremonial gravity. "This is from all of us," Martha said. "The whole town contributed something to welcome you to your new life." Sarah unwrapped the package carefully, revealing a beautiful photograph in a silver frame. The image showed her and Elias standing together outside their mountain cabin, taken by a traveling photographer who'd passed through Cedar Ridge the week before. But this wasn't just any photograph. The townspeople had pooled their resources to have it professionally mounted and framed, creating a family portrait worthy of any Eastern parlor. "It's for your mantelpiece," Martha explained, "so you'll always remember this day, and so visitors will know they're looking at a real family." Sarah stared at the photograph with wonder. There she was, standing beside the man who'd become her father, both of them looking directly at the camera with expressions of quiet contentment. They looked like they belonged together, not because of any physical resemblance, but because of the obvious love and trust that connected them. "We look like a family," she said softly. "You are a family," Martha replied firmly. "Blood doesn't make family, love does. And anyone with eyes can see that you two love each other like father and daughter should." As the afternoon wore on, the celebration evolved into something larger than anyone had planned. Word had spread to neighboring communities, and people began arriving from as far as 50 miles away. Families who'd been victims of the land syndicate, survivors of violence who'd thought justice would never come, children who'd been orphaned by the conspiracy's actions. They came to thank Elias and Sarah for their courage, but also to witness something rare and precious, proof that good could triumph over evil, that love could overcome hatred, and that families could be forged in the fires of adversity. Ezra McKinnon, his arm in a sling but his spirits high, proposed a toast as the sun began to set behind the mountain peaks. To James Whitmore, who found his courage when it mattered most. To Margaret and Thomas Mitchell, who died protecting their daughter, to all the families who suffered at the hands of evil men, and to Elias and Sarah Boone, who proved that love is stronger than fear. The assembled crowd raised their glasses, whiskey for the men, lemonade for the women and children, and drank to justice, family, and the future. But the most moving moment of the entire day came when Sarah asked Reverend Clark to say a special prayer. Standing before the crowd with the fearless dignity that had become her trademark, she spoke words that would be remembered in Cedar Ridge for generations to come. "Dear God," she said in her clear young voice, "thank you for bringing me to Elias, and for bringing Elias to me. Thank you for making us a family, even though we started out as strangers. And thank you for showing us that families aren't just about blood, they're about choosing to love each other, no matter what." She paused, looking up at Elias with eyes that held depths of love and trust that seemed impossible in someone so young. "Please watch over Mama and Papa and Grandpa James in heaven and help them know that I'm safe and happy and loved. And please help all the other children who need families to find people who will love them like Elias loves me." As the prayer ended and the crowd began to disperse, Sarah and Elias found themselves standing together in the gathering dusk, surrounded by the warm glow of community acceptance and shared celebration. "Ready to go home?" Elias asked. "I'm already home," Sarah replied, slipping her small hand into his larger one. "Home is wherever we're together." They walked toward their horse and wagon, leaving behind a community that had witnessed something extraordinary. The transformation of a feared mountain man and a traumatized orphan into a family bound by love, tested by fire, and blessed by the kind of happiness that comes only to those brave enough to choose each other against all odds. 2 years had passed since the events at Devil's Ridge, and the mountain cabin that had once sheltered a lonely, haunted man now rang with the laughter of a growing child and the quiet contentment of a father who'd finally found peace. The rough-hewn walls were now decorated with Sarah's drawings and schoolwork, while carefully tended flower boxes graced the windows that had once been defensively shuttered against the world. Elias stood on the front porch, watching 8-year-old Sarah feed the chickens while reciting her multiplication tables, a daily ritual that combined practical farm work with the education he was determined to provide. She'd grown taller and more confident over the past 2 years, but she'd retained the serious thoughtfulness and innate wisdom that had first attracted him to her. 7 times 8 is 56, she announced to Bessie, the brown hen who'd become her particular favorite. 8 times 8 is 64. 9 times 8 is 72. Very good, Elias called from the porch. Now try the 12s. Sarah wrinkled her nose in concentration. Mathematics had never been her strongest subject, but she approached every challenge with the same determination that had carried her through far greater difficulties. 12 times 1 is 12, 12 times 2 is 24, 12 times 3 is... She paused, counting on her fingers. 36. Excellent. When you finish with the chickens, we'll work on your reading lesson. The reading lessons had become the highlight of both their days. Sarah had progressed far beyond the simple primer she'd created during their first week together, devouring every book that Martha Henley could acquire from traveling merchants and mail-order catalogues. Her hunger for knowledge seemed boundless, fueled by her mother's early encouragement and her own natural curiosity about the world beyond their mountain refuge. This morning's lesson would focus on a letter that had arrived the previous day, correspondence from Marshal Hayes, updating them on the ongoing trials of the land syndicate conspirators. Cornelius Blackwood had been sentenced to 20 years in federal prison, while his associates had received terms ranging from 10 to 15 years. The financial penalties imposed on the syndicate had provided compensation for many of the families who'd lost their land and livelihoods, though no amount of money could restore the lives that had been lost. As Elias read through the marshal's letter, he reflected on how dramatically their lives had changed since that first afternoon, when Sarah had wiped away tears he hadn't even realized he was shedding. The fearsome reputation that had once isolated him from human contact had been replaced by a different kind of renown, that of a man who'd stood up to corruption and chosen love over safety. Visitors now came to their mountain cabin seeking advice, assistance, or simply the reassurance that justice could still triumph in an often cruel world. But the most profound changes were internal. The guilt and rage that had driven Elias to 5 years of mountain solitude had been replaced by purpose and contentment. Sarah had given him something more precious than redemption. She'd given him a reason to live that extended beyond mere survival or even justice. She'd made him a father, with all the responsibilities and joys that role entailed. "Papa," Sarah called, approaching the porch with her empty grain bucket. "Mrs. Martha's coming up the trail. She's got a package with her." Elias squinted toward the winding mountain path, making out Martha Henley's familiar figure riding her sturdy mare with a large wrapped bundle tied to her saddle. The older woman had become a regular visitor to their mountain home, bringing news from town, supplies they couldn't obtain locally, and the kind of grandmotherly affection that every child deserved. Today, however, her expression carried an excitement that suggested this visit was special. "Elias! Sarah!" Martha called as she dismounted near the cabin. "Wait until you see what came on today's stage." The package she carried was wrapped in brown paper and tied with string, but its contents were clearly books, several of them, judging by the weight and shape. Sarah's eyes lit up with anticipation as Martha handed over her precious cargo. "These came all the way from Boston," Martha explained, "from a publisher who heard about Sarah's story through Marshal Hayes. Seems they're starting a series of books for children who've overcome difficult circumstances, and they wanted Sarah to be one of their first readers." Sarah carefully unwrapped the package, revealing 5 brand new books with colorful illustrations and sturdy bindings. The titles ranged from adventure stories to educational texts, but each one bore an inscription, "For Sarah Boone, whose courage inspires children everywhere." "They know about me?" Sarah asked, wonder evident in her voice. "Child, your story has been in newspapers from Denver to Philadelphia," Martha replied. "The little girl who helped expose a criminal conspiracy and found a family with the mountain man everyone feared. You're quite famous." Elias felt a mixture of pride and protectiveness as he watched Sarah examine her books. Fame could be dangerous, especially for a child, but it could also open doors to opportunities that their isolated mountain life couldn't provide. "There's more," Martha continued, pulling out an official-looking letter. "This came addressed to both of you, from the territorial governor himself." The letter was written on heavy paper with an impressive official seal. As Elias read aloud, both he and Sarah learned that the territorial government wanted to establish a school for orphaned children, a place where youngsters who'd lost their families could receive education, care, and the chance to build new lives. They were offering Elias a position as the school's director, with Sarah as its first and youngest assistant teacher. "They want us to help other children like me," Sarah said softly, understanding the implications immediately. "They want you to share what you've learned about courage, family, and overcoming adversity," Martha clarified. "The governor thinks your experience could help other orphaned children believe that they can find happiness again." Elias set the letter down carefully, processing the magnitude of what was being offered. A chance to leave their mountain isolation for meaningful work that could benefit countless children, a way to transform their personal triumph into something larger and more lasting. "What do you think?" he asked Sarah, valuing her opinion despite her age. Sarah looked around their cabin at the flower boxes she'd planted, the pictures she'd drawn, the comfortable furniture they'd arranged together. This place had been their sanctuary, their refuge from a hostile world. But it had also taught them that home wasn't about location, it was about being together. "I think Mama and Papa would want us to help other children who are scared and alone," she said thoughtfully, "and I think Grandpa James would be proud if we used what happened to us to make good things happen for other people." Her wisdom, as always, cut straight to the heart of the matter. Their story had meaning beyond their personal happiness. It was proof that love could triumph over tragedy, that families could be forged in the most unlikely circumstances, and that courage could transform victims into survivors. "Then we'll do it," Elias decided. "We'll help them build that school, and we'll show other children that no matter how dark things get, there's always hope for a better future." Martha's smile was radiant. "I knew you'd say yes. The whole town's been talking about it, how proud we are to have contributed to something that will help children across the territory." As the afternoon sun slanted through the pine trees surrounding their cabin, the three of them sat on the front porch, planning for a future that would take them far from their mountain retreat, but not from the bonds they'd forged there. Sarah curled up against Elias's side with one of her new books, reading aloud about children who'd faced their own adventures and found their own happy endings. "Papa," she said during a pause in her reading, "do you think our story has a happy ending?" Elias looked down at his daughter legally, officially, and in every way that mattered, and felt the deep contentment that came from a life lived with purpose and love. "I think our story is just beginning," he said gently. The scary mountain man and the brave little girl became a family, and now they're going to help other families begin their own stories. Sarah nodded thoughtfully, then returned to her book. But after a few minutes she looked up again with the serious expression that always preceded her most important observations. "I'm glad I wiped away your tears that day," she said quietly. "It was the best decision I ever made." "It was the best decision both of us ever made," Elias replied, holding her close as the mountain evening settled around them like a blessing. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, father and daughter sat together in peaceful silence, surrounded by the warmth of their love and the promise of all the children they would yet help find their own happy endings. The scary mountain man had found his purpose, the little girl had found her forever family, and together they had proved that sometimes the most unlikely beginnings lead to the most beautiful stories. In the distance, the lights of Cedar Ridge twinkled like earthbound stars, reminding them that they were part of a larger community that had witnessed their transformation and would support their new mission. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities, but tonight was for gratitude, contentment, and the simple joy of being exactly where they belonged. Their story, which had begun with tears and fear and desperate loneliness, had become something beautiful, proof that love could conquer anything, that families were made by choice rather than blood, and that every ending was really just a new beginning in disguise.